content. So for the workshop itself, these slides that I'm presenting from are available on the GitHub site that I've sent the link out plenty of times. You can go to the meetup, right, and follow the link to the GitHub site that's got all the slides. It's got all the script for the labs. It's got all the scripts for the labs. It's got all of the recommendations for creating your own VM. And there's also, the slide deck itself has this particular slide where you can go to Data Exposed or Microsoft Mechanics, or go and download the demos, or take a look at the learning path for SQL Server 22. So there's quite a bit out there. And you can even get the SQL Server 22 Dev Edition to tinker with if you wanted to. Goals for this workshop, I just build out the slide. I mean, we want to give, and again, the goal overall from the product group all the way down to me delivering it to you now, you want to make sure it's interactive. You want to make sure you take this information and go try it. So I'm going to present some information today, and I want you to go try it on your own and think about it and start to evaluate if you want to upgrade to SQL Server 22. I've got some customers right now who are looking at SQL Server 22, and they're doing the preliminary assessments, and I'm kind of helping them think through what their choices are. And we'll talk about, and we've talked about how specific key features work in SQL Server 22. And this will also give you a good chance to, at the very least, go into Azure, go into Marketplace, spin up the gallery image with SQL Server 22 configured on Windows Server 22, and just spin that up and give it a shot. And then, walk away with those resources because of your hands-on experience, because of perspective you gained. You should be able to make that decision about whether or not you want to upgrade. Again, this is our, how many meetings is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's our 6th meeting in 2023. And again, this is a two-parter because last July, at the end of July, we did the first part of this module 4, powering your database with security, scalability, and availability. The reason I have it broken up, you'll see when we get into the scalability and availability pieces, there's a lot of information to pass along that you'll want to try and just check out, or features you'll know about. Next month, accessing new sources with data virtualization, object storage. That might not be that long of a chapter. And then neither will enhancing your application with new T-SQL capabilities around JSON and time SQL and new raw, just transact SQL statements and capabilities that you can kind of leverage. And we'll show you those. November 17th, we might change the content of that. We might do a little bit of review or not. I talked to Alex Powers to talk about to see if he's available to talk. He's on the Microsoft Power BI program manager team, product management team. I don't know for sure his role, but he's inside of Microsoft. But he might talk about Microsoft Fabric and Power Query, and that might be another joint Power BI, DC, and Nova data platform meetup. I haven't talked to the Power BI DC people, but I'm thinking that's what it could be. I meet with Alex Powers next Tuesday to talk about the November 17th opportunity. So that might be review what we learned maybe, but also Microsoft Fabric, which I'm sure we're interested in as well. We did have our Azure OpenAI and ChatGPT Boot Camp on August the 11th. We had it in Reston, Virginia. We had over 100 people in attendance. It was a paid event, right? It's not a Microsoft event. Microsoft's not charging you money, but the user group was charging you money because what happens to the poor uneaten pizzas, right? For no-shows. So we didn't have no-shows. We had 100 people, 105 people register, and we had over 100 people in attendance, especially when you count in the sponsors and staff. So it was really good. And we had, I'll have to look at the agenda, but we had about 8 speakers doing little 45-minute sessions, just rotating in and out, and it was really good. The downside is that we didn't record the sessions because, and that's the first time I'd ever done an event in the Freedom address in Reston, is that can you guess? The the audio visual hookups weren't working that well. We had to do some trickeration where we had one person, we had laptops being shared from the podiums, the far left and the far right podiums, present from the middle podium. But that's not supposed to work like that at all. It's supposed to be, hey, I'm going to do the option to say, hey, I'm going to present from the middle podium, and I want you to broadcast to the far left and the far right podiums. And that wasn't working. Everybody could hear, everybody could see, once we got it figured out, and it was before the people started to show up. But yeah, that's a little bit frustrating. So I probably will do an event. And I'll talk to Prashant about it. We'll probably do another event in the spring. But man, this was not a pleasant experience. Just the prep. The actual event itself was really good. The resources for this meeting are all at AKMS Cloud Events. I had that on the opening slide. The workshop is at AKMS/SQL 2022 workshop. It's going to take you to the GitHub repository that's got the slides, the labs, the setup for the virtual machines. You can't, it'd be really tough to mess this up. We don't have any Azure passes to do anything kind of cool with, because this isn't really like the Azure Pass story. That's funny, because back when I first started doing community events, they were passing out Azure passes like Monopoly money. I would ask for 50 passes from an internal email, and I'd get 50 passes. I got 200 passes for a chain of workshops I was doing. But now it's really, if you ask for passes, it needs to be tied to an internal, like an opportunity number, this map to a customer, this got people on top of it. So it's not as easy as it used to be, but we don't have Azure passes, right? And then again, slides are on the GitHub site, and then this recording, we'll put it on our AKMS/Azure Cloud Events on our YouTube site, where we've got every one of these 2023 meetups and every 22 meetup, all the way back to we started doing the virtual stuff with COVID. Side note, I think my last, because I'm handing over the user group, the meetup in November. So whatever happens after that, it's up to the person who's taking over. But I'm gonna let him know, hey, I do recordings here, and I do more virtual meetups. But I think he's gonna try to do some in-person stuff. Some additional resources, if you haven't gotten it, grab this off of Amazon, and just download it as a Kindle edition, or you can get the hardcover. I've got the hardcover version of his Azure SQL, but not the hardcover of his SQL Server 22. I have the Kindle version, but it's really good. It's really informative. Like today, for example, I was doing a little bit of research in advance of this presentation, and I couldn't find it on the interwebs, but I found it in his book. So that, I find that to be super helpful. And again, the workshop itself is broken into an intro to SQL Server 22, connecting to Azure SQL 22, right? We have some big things, big hero capabilities with connecting to Azure we'll talk about. And then then we have module 3, accelerating performance with built-in query intelligence, which we talked about in June. And then we're going to finish up our second part of our chat on security, scalability, and availability. And then next month, we're going to talk about data virtualization, and then T-SQL capabilities. And then we'll talk about, new, summary and closing. But in the slide decks, you can see what they're intending for summary and closing. So I'm going to turn off my camera. You know why? You've heard me tell the story. I talk with my hands. So I'm going to turn off my camera and jump into the actual content of the user group. So we always begin the user group with sort of we don't go into the knowledge checks on here, but we do want to go into, SQL Server 22 and some of the talk about the paths about where it came from, right? With SQL Server 2016. Side note, if you're watching this video or you're watching the June or the May or the April video, you'll see these slides over and over again. Because I want to preface the chat with some of these introductory slides about SQL Server 22. That's why I do them. But again, with SQL Server 2016, we started with, Query Store to be able to create external tables to Azure, SQL blob storage and HD Insight with Polybase, and always encrypted, being able to have a column that's encrypted and have your application driver and your permissions be able to decrypt that data, that provides that role level security. Didn't say row, but role based duty, separation of duties. And then we had row level security. And what I mean by always encrypted and role level security, the DBA might not need to see ever a column on social security numbers, or email, or salary numbers. That might not be within the database administrator's job to see that. So that's what always encrypted allows, that data to be encrypted and not be seen by people who don't have permissions. And then we have row level security, as well as dynamic data masking, not doing any real changing of the data in general, but row level security. Based on your role, you can see certain rows, and then that's done by a sort of a filtering technique around being able to block or filter out data based on your role and the rows that are assigned to that role, roughly speaking. It also runs faster. There's some different things, and some different things you can do with the SQL Server Standard Edition that are improved in terms of the surface area. What can I configure? SQL Server 2017 introduced the ability to run SQL Server workloads on Linux. Also, with our big data architecture, we now support running on containers, Docker and Kubernetes containers, and create control nodes and master nodes that that connect to underlying storage to separate that compute and storage layer. Adaptive query processing. So improvements on the engine in terms of how queries are being handled. Um, Automated tuning, graph database, connection to the graph database, and also machine learning services. And then with SQL Server 2019, we kind of continued on the path. Data virtualization, being able to hit third-party data targets, or data stored on third-party targets. Intelligent query processing, improvements on top of that adaptive query processing, accelerated data recovery, things that help transaction log processing for things like always on availability groups, but also restores when you're thinking about just restore activities. And then also the ability inside of SQL Server to do data classification, which you can now do in Microsoft Purview, and you can do data classification in SQL Server 22. But really, you'd want to make sure that your data is classified at the according to your preferences, or the database owners or the data owners preferences inside of your data source, and then pass that classification information up to Microsoft Purview. But Purview can also help you step you through the classification process. And then the whole move from the edge to the cloud, trying to make sure that all the tools and the experience is familiar, and there's flexibility from that intelligent edge where you have IoT or Internet of Things devices, all the way into the cloud and also on-prem. We try to make sure there's a SQL offering. So there's Azure SQL Edge on IoT devices. On-prem, there's SQL Server on Windows hosts, and SQL Server on Linux hosts, and containers, Docker containers, and Kubernetes containers. There's also being able to tie in your SQL Server on-prem installations, but integrate that into your Azure portal with your Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server, and that lets you expose things like patching and automatic, not patching, but Microsoft Defender, and be able to see those on-prem nodes, but in your Azure SQL data portals with that Azure Arc enabled SQL Server, then Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance, and then SQL Server on virtual machines. And then with SQL Server on virtual machines, there's something called the IaaS extension agent, or the IaaS agent extension, and that is infrastructure as a service agent extension. And what that is that allows for that virtual machine, right? If you're in Azure and you just have a virtual machine, there's really nothing to tell Azure that it's got SQL Server on it, that IaaS agent extension does that. It says, hey, there's SQL Server running on this box. And then once you have that configured, then you can do automated patching, automated backups, temp DB interactions, IO interactions. Mike, you add Microsoft Defender. I think I said patching. You can do patching and the automated, I believe it said automated backups. So that SQL Server on virtual machines, that's important as well. And then SQL Server on an Azure managed instance, or just SQL running on an Azure SQL database, right? If you don't want any of that, you just want the interaction with the database itself, and you still want to do things like column level encryption and row level security and dynamic data masking and automated query tuning and leverage the Azure SQL management capabilities. Azure SQL Database is a good place to start without having to worry about, let me configure SQL Server at the instance level, and let me worry about administering and managing the OS at the OS level in which SQL Server runs. And then SQL Server 22, let me just build the slide out. Sorry, I went too far. Yeah. Again, with SQL Server 22, we've got these additional capabilities on top of what you already see from SQL Server 2019. Absolutely some improvements, but where we added in the ability to link SQL Server 22 to an Azure SQL managed instance through an always on availability group, to link to Synapse and to be a data source for Synapse where you send data to a landing zone, and that landing zone is basically picked up and piped into Azure storage and then can be read into Azure Synapse and later presented in a report. And then Microsoft Purview, where you can do the insights and see where see the steps the data took from its source to its destination, and get data classification, data categorization information to set up policies and Purview that will impact what you can do on your Azure SQL nodes and your Azure SQL managed instance, but also your SQL Server 22 machines. You can integrate those into Purview with the ARC enabled agent on it, and you can have policies around who can do what on your SQL Server 22 boxes. They're absolutely a secure relational database management system, but we've added things like ledger. So if you want to check a record for who updated a table or who removed a record or inserted a record, you can have a ledger that uses blockchain technology to have an immutable record. And we covered this last month, that immutable record of who did what to your SQL Server. And it's also stored out of SQL Server. It's stored in encrypted storage so that if you need access to provide to an audit team, they can come in and quickly see that without interacting with your SQL Server objects themselves. And then, of course, there's the built-in query intelligence. And then again, we're providing that on Azure SQL Edge, ARC-enabled data services, and then Azure SQL. And again, the pieces that we're focusing on for this workshop, right? There's being able to connect to the cloud, Azure SQL connection, or a SQL Server connection to Azure SQL Managed Instance through a database availability group, a distributed availability group that you could fail over from SQL Server 22 to your Azure SQL Managed Instance. And then you could also fail back if you needed to fail back. You could also do a restore from Azure SQL Managed Instance to a SQL Server 22 instance. The connection to Microsoft Purview, and then the connection to Azure Synapse. Those are super important. And then the built-in query intelligence around being able to help do that internal systems and processes that helps queries, not auto-tune for sure, but helps queries provide intelligence about what is running and its impact on CPU and memory and wait times, but also to use those metrics to help improve the query as it runs forward. And then we talked about security last meeting, but today we're going to talk about scalability and availability. And then we'll talk about data virtualization and object storage, and then extending T-SQL and JSON and time series queries. I did delete that slide where it says Pervy's list. Pervy is an internal engineer or a product manager inside of SQL Server. I should delete that. If you look at the slide from the GitHub workshop, you'll see Pervy's list is about a list of about 5 things that are targeted to be done, and that some of them are in preview, some haven't been implemented yet. But don't worry about it. We won't discuss it on this particular this workshop. All right, so we talked about security. We talked about Ledger. We talked about some of the always encrypted enhancements. Now, how you can do joins and comparisons against both randomized and deterministic encryption. And we talked about the protocol to connect to the server with the tabular data stream version 8.0. We talked about today we're going to talk about some scalability enhancements. Some of it's kind of flat, right? There's not a very colorful way to talk about buffer pool parallel scans, but we do have some demos. And then we'll also talk about availability. So again, the security enhancements that we talked about specifically last week or last month, Ledger, we talked about always encrypted. We talked about the connectivity requirements for transport layer security and TDS. We talked about PFX certificate support. We talked about those new granular fixed server roles and enhancements for dynamic data masking. Go back and look at the video or look at the slide deck if you want to take a look at those. So let's talk about some scalability enhancements. We'll talk about buffer pool parallel scan, HandsFree Temp DB, auto sync, update stats, concurrency, AutoDrop Statistics, XML compression, improve column store segmentation, and ordered clustered column store index. And I've got a demo on the HandsFree Temp DB. And again, this is really bland, but the buffer pool parallel scan that improves the performance of the buffer pool scan operations on large memory machines by utilizing multiple CPU cores. Side note, I am reading that slide, but I also just, I wrote that slide. There's HandsFree Temp DB. This is adding on to what the content that's already there. It's really a concurrency improvement, right? You have concurrent updates to your global allocation map. This is how your data gets stored, and your index information gets stored, your pages and your extents get stored, and your shared global allocation map. When you have these updates to these pages, they reduce page latch contention while allocating and deallocating data pages and extents. And these enhancements apply to all the user databases. It especially benefits these heavy temp DB workloads. We'll see that in a demo for the page latch weights and the batch requests per second. Auto sync update stats concurrency. Again, it helps you avoid concurrency issues using asynchronous stats update. If you enable the async stats update, wait at low priority. When are you going to fire my stats update? So it waits till there's a lull, basically. There's an auto drop statistics, allows the user to create statistics to behave like auto created stats. If a user created stat is set with the auto drop option, it'll be automatically dropped if a schema change happens. XML compression provides a method to compress off-row XML data for both XML columns and indexes and improving capacity requirements. And then improved column store segmentations. All these column store indexes benefit from enhanced segment elimination by the data type, and your data type choices might have a significant impact on your query performance based on common filter predicates for the queries on the column store indexes. And that segment elimination is applied to numeric date and time data types, and the date time offset data type with a scale less than equal or 2. So beginning in SQL Server 22, that segment elimination capabilities extend to string, binary, and GUID data type, and the date time offset for the scale of greater than 2. Then the ordered clustered column store index, it sorts that existing data in memory before that index builder compresses the data into those index segments, those index little blob artifacts, and that has the potential of more efficient segment elimination, and that results in better performance as the number of segments to read from disk is reduced. Now here's the actual workshop slide around, around the hands-free temp DB. And there's some elements of pre-2019, some things they brought in with 2019, and some post-2019. So before we got to SQL Server 2019, there was a file for your page free space and your global allocation map and your shared global allocation map. You could have contention. You could, to prevent that, right, you would add multiple files, and you could leverage trace flags 117, or trace flag 1117 and 1118. Really, those are deprecated after 2016. And then, when you did the setup with SQL Server 2016, you could do additional or multiple files for setting up your temp DB, which made it very convenient, right? It was an additional step during installation that you could do right there in the main GUI for installing, rather than having be a post-installation configuration step. And then those trace flags weren't required by the time you hit SQL Server 2016. With SQL Server 2019, there was page free space concurrency. And then you could also set your auto grow, and you could have a uniform default set for your temp DB. And then now your system tables could become hotspots for master and MSDB and model. Your temp DB, your metadata optimization. There's some optimized metadata to make certain counters and your latches and your locks that you would otherwise have on temp DB not be there. And then you still have this SGAM, the shared global allocation map, and your global allocation map contention. 22, they implemented where there's more concurrency, less contention, no contention, because these latches, the contention on the latch level is gone, and they would be latching based on these artifacts in your shared global allocation map and your global allocation map. Let's take a look at the demo here. Yep, sorry. Let me bring this up. So here we've got temp DB, we see. Is it not going? Is it going? Got temp DB. We've got 8 megabytes of rows there for our data and our log information. And then we're going to do some selects from temp DB. Now, the first demo, we're going to show that only the page file, page free space concurrency from 2019. We'll do one where we're using that metadata optimization, but not with the SQL Server 22 enhancements. And then the last one, we'll do all these optimizations will be on. And the counters we're going to use, which is we're going to use batch requests per second for a performance monitor, which is, it indicates number of batches or commands that are executed on SQL Server per second. And then we're also going to use where's the page latch, which we're referred to, or the a wait event that occurs in SQL Server when a task is waiting. And so we're going to disable any of the optimizations in temp DB, and they're going to restart SQL Server. So we restarted SQL Server. Now we're going to add some workload to it. But again, this workload itself is going to not have any of the big optimizations. So now the SQL Server starting, and we're going to, and we've got page requests per second and page latch waits per second. And we're going to have some workload, and we can see our batch request per second is going to be pretty high, and our page latch waits is also going to be pretty high. So we got a lot of waits. We can see here our different waits So page latch weight's pretty darn high on those minimal optimizations from SQL Server 2019. So that query itself is gonna take about 19 some seconds, and compared to the other queries, it's gonna be much faster. Then we're gonna do change this to where it's optimized, but not optimized for the SQL Server 22 stuff, but just temp metadata optimization is on. And then we're going to go ahead and restart the service with the temp metadata optimization on, and then restart a performance monitor, and then do some stressing against to do some workload. And we can see again, our page latch requests are still relatively, they're not high, but they certainly spike. We'll do some execution here. We can see our wait information, and we see we get waiting on GAM pages. We see page latch per second, or page latch waits fairly high, and then our batch requests, they spiked, but they're not as high as previous. But again, we got some optimization. So now let's go in and have the SQL Server 22 optimizations where you don't have any contention on your SGAM and your GAM pages. And this is going to still take 28 seconds. And then now with all the optimizations on for this next demo, we'll go ahead and restart SQL. Let it start and stop. And then let us do some more stresses. Again, you see no latch contention. You see the batch requests go way down. Page latch requests basically register 0 because there's no SGAM GAM contention. Notice how it just fell off. And again, that's going to take no time to run that. It's going to take 12 seconds to run that. All right, that's that demo. So let's go back over to the content. If you got any questions, chime in. It's a small group. Now there's some additional. Again, it gets this section gets kind of dry, but we'll come back and do a demo on contained availability groups. But the availability enhancements are contained availability groups, cross-platform snapshot backups, Intel Quick Assist backup compression, accelerated database recovery enhancements, in-memory OLTP memory enhancements, shrink database concurrency enhancements. I'm sorry, I didn't know if I got a question or not. Parallel redo enhancements, database availability enhancements. Really, that's contained availability, and then the Azure SQL Managed Instance link to SQL Server 22, Resumable add constraint, create index concurrency, last valid restore time in the backup set, MSDB table, and last writer wins, AutoConflict peer-to-peer, AutoConflict for peer replication, for peer-to-peer replication. Sorry about that. So what is a contained availability group? We have a better slide on this here. Yeah. So what is a contained availability group? It's a new feature in SQL Server 22 that really makes sure that your master and your MSDB are part of the DAG and synced. So logins, job permissions, they help you reduce the amount of overhead. Ideally, right? If you have an always on availability group and you have multiple databases being replicated across the availability group across, I don't know, 8 nodes, 1 primary and 8 secondaries or some configuration, then you have to go and make sure that the logins, jobs, and permissions are configured on all of those additional servers and as part of your always on availability group. Because if you fail over to a server that's hosting a replica, then it needs to make sure the logins and the jobs and the permissions are there. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of pain. And again, there's some potential issues when you're going through SSMS and configuring this. There's some certain DMVs that might need improvement, and also the setup wizard. There's some. So you got to be very specific on making sure you're selecting the MSDB and master to be a part of your contained availability group. And so what is it trying to do, right? You have to manually synchronize instance level objects between between these nodes, these instances in your availability group. That is a challenge. But what you would do is you create an availability group and declare it to be contained. And then you add a contained mastered MSDB, and then you connect with the listener and with the listener that the master and the MSDB are being used. You connect directly, and then default master and your model are used, right? I think those two bullets didn't make sense. I didn't write those, but really you connect with the listener, right? And the listener is going to send you to the primary replica. And then your agent is enhanced to understand contained MSDBs, which is important, right? Because you don't want the actual SQL agent to not perform well because you've got these contained MSDB databases and it's not interacting with your agent, right? Your agent utilizes your MSDB to run jobs. Contained AGs work by having a primary and secondary, but there you have a contained master and a contained MSDB, and they replicate changes and replicate logins and replicate jobs between the members of the contained AG. So that if you fail over from your primary or secondary, then those replicas or those replicated databases, those user databases, have the permissions and the jobs and the logins that are needed to access those replicated DBs by having your system databases replicated as well. That's primarily what it is. And you connect to the listener, just like, or you can do a direct database connect. That's least preferred, but you connect to the listener, and then it routes you to the primary, or you can go into the direct database. But on either one of those databases, you should be able to go in and look at the replicated master, replicated MSDB for your contained availability groups, and you should have synchronized changes. Let's take a look at the demo real quick on that. So here is a demo on contained availability groups. And so the big thing is that you are you're creating an availability group and you're saying, hey, uh, I'm creating this with the cluster type of contained, right? So I'm saying no, don't use Windows clustering, but use the contained availability group type for SQL Server 22. And then I've got my availability group master, my availability group MSDB, and then my availability group normal databases. Then I've got my replicas, right? My primary and secondary replicas. And then I've got my availability databases, my user database, and then my two system databases. And I've got two nodes, my VM1 and my VM2, that are part of my availability group. And right now we're looking at VM1. And there's a job on VM1 that I want to make sure is available on VM2. So I've got my on just VM1 itself, not in part of the availability group. I've got a job and I've got, my user database, and that's just a connection to the server itself, not to the availability group. And then here I've got my VM1 and VM2 I want to connect to and do a failover from VM1 to VM2. And I'm going to accept the warnings about asynchronous, replication and confirm failover with potential data loss, which is a feature of a feature, but a consequence of using asynchronous replication. Do my little connection, and then I'll finish and I'll fail over, right? So we're now, my VM2 is now my primary. And I can see that VM2 has my databases, has my synchronized master databases. And then now VM2, because it's the primary, it has the sys purge history job running in it. And VM2 is my secondary. It's got my user database and then my non-availability group test job inside of it. The main thing about contained availability groups to think about is that it's a great way to replicate your system databases to avoid the problem of having to go in and do um, a lot of that post availability group creation of logins and jobs and permissions to make sure everything's just right. This saves you a step. The rest of this gets kind of dry. There's cross-platform snapshot backups where you can do backups in minutes, right? You can go in and back up a terabyte database in seconds or minutes or seconds or milliseconds. It uses storage that support snapshots like Azure Storage. It works on Windows and Linux. Um, you might see write log waits if you get suspended issue with taking a snapshot backup. That's you might or might not, but there you can use a trace flag 3661 to test it. Um, Before there was a VDI program and a virtual VSS and SQL writer for the snapshots. Now it's you can do the T-SQL where the IO is suspended, the snapshots performed, and then you can resume your IO. Let me go ahead and show you that demo real quick. Now this demo is we'll just look at the demo. How about that? We'll look at the demo. So here in this demo, here we are. Yeah, we've got our disk space usage report on our big SQL DB. We've got a pretty large database here, and we're going to use master. We're going to create a credential, or we're going to back up that database to an Azure Blob Storage credential. We're not creating a backup just yet, so we're doing a backup to the Azure SQL Storage on a Azure SQL Storage blob, and there it is. Did just a vanilla backup for our big SQL DB database. At 485 megabytes a second. Then we can go look at Windows Explorer. Just got our data and log volume on F. We can see our snapshot data disk. Then we have our source disk, our snapshot data disk. We see that it's full. And now let's do a snapshot of this. So we're going to do big SQL DB. We're going to suspend the IO for the snapshot, perform the snapshot, and then resume the IO. And again, what this is for is to really speed up the backup of really big databases. So we suspend the IO, do a really big backup, or snapshot backup that we can see here on our snapshot disk. I'm going to create this snapshot, SQL 22 snapshot from disk, from data disk, incremental. You do a full or incremental version. We'll do incremental, review and create. Let this cook for a second. Deployment's in progress. go to the resource. So now let's back up this metadata, not with a BAK file, but with a BKM file, right? We're not backing up data pages, we're backing up metadata, and then let's resume the IO. Attach or create a new disk based on the storage snapshot, and then execute a restore to a new database using the new file location. So you can use these snapshots for data restores from the snapshot backup. So we'll do a restore here from the metadata backup onto big SQL DB2 from the snapshot backup. Take some time here, not too long. And you can see there, the database has been restored. And it's moved it from F to G for the new backup, for the new database itself. I'll move through the rest of this because this is kind of dry, but that's okay. There's also Intel Quick Assistant technology for things like high performance workloads and compression of backups to offload the impact of compression off of your server onto the Intel Quick Assist technology. I'll just kind of move through that. You would install the drivers, determine if the hardware, software, determine if you want hardware, software based. You would back up with compression, and then some of the observations again. Hardware mode shines with multiple backup files, and then it usually outperforms default compression. And then there's accelerated data recovery enhancements. Yikes! I didn't know I created that bold font. It's okay. It improves performance, reduces time it takes to recover a database after a crash or failover. One of these enhancements is the ability to use AD. It helps improve the performance of Temp DB and reduce the time it takes to recover Temp DB after a crash or failover. Another enhancement is the ability to use ADR with in-memory OLTP. And again, it helps to improve the performance of in-memory OLTP and then reduce the time it takes to improve from a failover. Some improved in-memory enhancements. Again, it's really baked in the engine with no user interaction required. There's a new system stored procedure. I say new, but there's been some improvements to it. It's sys sp xtp underscore force gc, but it also came out in SQL Server 2019 cumulative update 13, and it causes that in-memory engine to release memory related to deleted rows of in-memory data that are eligible for things like garbage collection that haven't been released by the processes. There's also shrink database concurrency. There's a wait at low priority. It's available for your DBCC shrink database and DBC shrink file. It reduces lock contention basically, and that means when you have a shrink command and you do it with the wait at low priority, the new queries that require schema stability locks are not blocked by the waiting shrink operation until the shrink operation stops waiting and start executing. It's basically, it says, hey, we can run this shrink, but after anything else is running on the database or the tables. Parallel redo enhancements too. There's parallel redo thread pool, and that'll improve the redo performance in SQL Server 22. And it's valuable for databases. We have a lot of redo work around updated databases and database partitioning and always on. And there's also parallel redo, batch redo, and that enhances redo performance by batching together redo of contiguous log records, and that involves grouping together log records that appear consecutively in the log file into a single batch, and then it's redone by a single thread. Again, the database DAG enhancements. I just kind of threw this in because it was a bullet, but really your improvements to your DAGs are contained availability group, which we just looked at, and then Azure SQL managed instance connectivity from your data availability group. And then there's Resumable add constraint, and that allows you to pause and resume. The process of adding a constraint to a table and applies when you add a new primary key or unique key to a table using the alter table command. The alter table command requires including the option with online, and this is useful for really big tables where adding a constraint can take a long time. And then there's create index concurrency. So if you're doing things like creating, rebuilding, or dropping indexes online, that online option allows the concurrent users to access underlying table information or clustered index data and any associated non-clustered indexes during these index operations. And what that basically means is while an index is being created, rebuilt, or dropped, users can still access the data in the table or the clustered index and any of your associated non-clustered index. There's also a last valid restore time in your backup set MSDB table, and it's been added, and it shows the last point in time to which the backup can be restored. It is important that this column only shows the last valid restore time in the transaction log backup sets, and in full backup and differential backup, it'll return null, and it's good for using these point in time recovery scenarios. And then there's a last writer wins um, AutoConflict for peer-to-peer replication. And it's a method to resolve conflicts that was really introduced in SQL Server 2019 Cumulative Update 13. And then with this method, you can configure peer-to-peer replication and automatically resolve conflicts by allowing the most recent insert or the update to win the conflict. And if either write deletes the row, the server allows the delete to win the conflict, and it provides another option when configuring conflict resolution in peer-to-peer replication. Real quick on the knowledge check. Independent verification for Ledger is done. Again, this is back to last month. Database digests. SQL Server now eliminates what type of bottleneck for Temp DB? Page latch bottlenecks. Contained availability group replicates which objects? Link servers, SQL Server agents, logins, all the above. Really all the above. Any of your configuration information that's in your master DB or your MSDB is now transferred between those servers in your availability group. And then what are the benefits of using Intel Quick Assist with SQL Server 22? Right, it's improved backup compression and being able to offload that compression work for your SQL Server workloads. All right, so that wraps up this module on security, availability, and scalability. We talked about Ledger. We talked about latch page concurrency improvements. The sort of a hands-free Temp DB, enhancements in availability that talk about contained availability groups, cross-platform snapshot backups, Intel Quick Assist technology, and then go check out the documentation because there's like 25 plus major enhancements to the SQL Server 22 for these categories. All right, guys. Do we have any questions at all about anything before we break for the weekend? It's going to be a good weekend, I hope. And let me turn my camera back on. To the taskbar, show teams. Sorry, I always fight with this. But anyway, guys, are there any questions about anything? No? All right. Well, I will have this posted.
Are there any machine learning procedures that are getting introduced? Like,
Actually, machine learning server was deprecated for SQL Server 22 because we didn't really have enough customer momentum to start building, leveraging machine learning server. So any of the machine learning stuff from SQL Server 22 in terms of the server itself and being able to leverage R and Python and have it served by the server, that's being deprecated. But there's plenty of documentation out there about what you can do with maybe the new stuff around hitting a data source that's got machine learning models and then pulling that into SQL Server. But I don't believe you could do much with, you can't configure R any longer in SQL Server 22, or it's absolutely deprecated.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, guys. Have a good weekend. The recording will be up. Oh, thank you very much for saying that about the demo. Thank you very much for saying that. And thank you, George. All right. Have a good Labor Day weekend next week, and I'll talk to you in September. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. I'll hit
Bye.
stop on the recording.